legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today my guest is Daniel Drasin, who joins us to discuss his book, A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time and the Consciousness Code. Sharing his more than 3 decades of research into the afterlife and paranormal phenomena, Drasin shows that the continuity of human consciousness beyond the physical body and after death constitutes a legitimate area of scientific inquiry and that it can be objectively demonstrated. Drasin begins by revealing how our belief in materialism, through its effects on our social norms, taboos, and even language, has deeply constrained our civilization's understanding of the nature of space, time, life, death, and consciousness. However, our deeply ingrained cultural habits tied to materialism have begun to change. Drasin explores 15 promising post-materialistic scientific investigations currently underway, focusing in depth on examples that offer the most objectively or irrefutable evidence for the survival of consciousness. Drasin shows how, by thinking and speaking about death and the survival of consciousness in new ways, we can facilitate a clearer, more relaxed, comfortable, and rational conversation about what awaits us all, sooner or later, on the other side of life. Hello and welcome, Dan, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg.
Dan, today we're talking about your new book, your first book, in fact, as you've just informed me. That's entitled A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code. Before we jump into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Well, for most of my life professionally, I've been a media producer, cinematographer, documentary cameraman, traveled quite extensively, and have an abiding interest in different ways of looking at things. I've had a pretty interesting engagement with the sciences and the arts over the course of my life, and so I'm interested in different perspectives. I also have had, or I should say, been blessed with a number of experiences in my life that one might consider paranormal, and that sort of jump-started my interest in the afterlife and consciousness and so on. So that's, in a nutshell, that's my background.
You mentioned some of your work as a filmmaker, and I looked up some of your titles, and some of them relate to some of the subject matter. You also mentioned these experiences that you had that piqued your interest and stimulated you to look further into the fabric of reality. What has this been a lifelong thing for you? Did you experience anything as a child, or was it later as an adult? What was it you'd mark out as a turning point? Or maybe there was more than one of those.
Well, as far as I can tell, my first inkling that things aren't necessarily as they appear on the surface of things was experiencing a number of precognitive dreams as a young child. And they were puzzling to me, but they taught me that, as I've put it, in the theater of life, stuff goes on backstage. In other words, we're not necessarily privy to the whole spectrum of reality. And, science itself has pretty well established this. I mean, we understand that our senses, our physical senses, are very limited in what they can perceive. So, my youthful experiences did point me in the direction of curiosity and fascination with, especially with things which were said to be taboo in the culture. For example, the whole UFO ET issue. which has fascinated me for most of my life, as well as the sociology of these things that are considered taboo. They're fodder for the pathological skeptics who behave in the most unscientific manner when confronting these things. Anyway, it was about 30 years ago when I first became focused on the question of the afterlife. And I don't actually like the term afterlife. I think it's too restrictive. I tend to prefer the term the greater reality, because in my view, the greater reality sort of wraps around our ordinary reality in terms of space, time, consciousness, and so on. It seems to me to be the larger context in which our familiar physical reality resides, and which may well be the source of it. That our physical plane is perhaps a lower frequency of something much larger and more refined and more conscious.
Well, the word afterlife makes me think of afterthought. It feels like, life is the main event, and then, there might be some kind of anomalous experience on the other side of it. But at the end of the day, what you and I are sharing now is it. This is really as good as it gets, type thing. Right. And I think you're absolutely correct that it's the reverse is almost the case. The experience that you and I and everyone listening to this now are sharing is just embedded in this much wider reality. For me, I remember it was something as simple as learning in biology, for example, that dogs and cats, and indeed many other animals, but they could see and hear. Their sense spectrum went well beyond that of humans. And I thought, well, when cats are reacting to something that we can't see, are they reacting to nothing? And if not, then what does that mean? What else is out there beyond the limits of our five senses? And then it was in physics and chemistry, maybe looking down a microscope and just seeing all this stuff again, that these instruments were allowing us to see that we can't normally perceive. And again, I thought, well, then what's in terms of the micro and the macro, what else is out there? And then being fascinated by astronomy and how little we know about what lies beyond the Earth, and on and on and on. And then formative experiences like Arthur C. Clarke's television series that he did, World of Strange Powers, and whichever one, the other one, there were two series he did and books based on them, all about paranormal and supernatural so-called anomalies, events, experiences, and what all that meant. As you say, but all of this was very much surrounded by a taboo, very much like the taboo around death, the taboos around sexuality, all these things. But for me, that was all the more reason to look at it, because if I've learned one thing in life, if you forces or entities or whatever, or even governments, society, culture are trying to steer you away from something that you're drawn to, then that in itself means that you should be looking more closely at it.
Absolutely, and I think this merges into the question of psychological and political freedom. That the focus, I think, is now increasingly on trusting and understanding our own perceptions, particularly in this area. That when we're told what to think and what to believe, very often our psyches follow behind what we're supposed to think and believe. This is certainly true in the scientific and academic communities, where it's very difficult for anyone who has an interest in or has had experiences outside the box to speak about them publicly. Rupert Sheldrake, who's one of my heroes, has often pointed out that in the pubs after hours is where the truth gets told within cultures like the academic community, where people can let their hair down and trust one another. So we speak of paranormality. How do we know what's normal if we can't openly speak about it? How do we know what's supernatural if we don't understand the limits of nature? A lot of this is just semantic games. And that, I think, it's one of the reasons why the longest chapter in my book, which is called "Don't Eat the Menu," is about semantics and about how language tends to structure our sense of reality, our belief systems, and so on. And when our very words are censored in one sense or another by our culture, I think everyone suffers in the end. Certainly people who've had so-called paranormal experiences have often been subject to ridicule and professional dismissal and even confinement to psychiatric institutions. And this really has to stop. And I hope that those of us who are involved in this field, whatever aspect of the paranormal we're focused on, can help to free people's sense of what's permissible and to feel more comfortable about sharing these things, with their families, their intimate friends, and even within their professions. My sense of it is that probably almost everyone has had one or another experience in this way and would be dying to talk about it if they knew it was okay. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, every word of it. I mean, one of my most recent interviews prior to this one was with the American author Paul Levy, and in his early life, he had a sort of a psychotic break, a sort of just an episode really that turned out to be the making of him. It really was a transformation, but initially it was a horrible experience for him, and he was confined to a psychiatric unit and medicated, and basically told that he was losing his mind. The reverse was true, really. He was discovering something, So yeah, I write a lot about and speak a lot about popular culture and about media and perception management and control. And reality really is a kind of battle of perceptions. And you only have to look at some of the big events in human affairs in recent decades and how those have played out in the media, particularly now in the 21st century with 24/7 media matrix and social media.
Sure.
And it's all these different versions of reality. And definitely if you allow your perceptions to be managed and massaged, then they will be into falling in with a particular, usually very narrow narrative.
Right. I agree. Absolutely. And, this, to me, it's just an overbearing aspect of human psychology. I don't necessarily attribute many of these things to evil intent. I think it's just the nature of our collective awareness at this point in time that has a tendency to perpetuate this state of affairs. We use the word reality. I just wanted to get into that for a moment. Part of my chapter on semantics deals with the word reality, because I think all of our ideas and opinions and experiences and so on ultimately come down to that term. The point that I arrive at in the book is that it's arbitrary, it's subjective. So if we need this word in our vocabulary at all, and we're speaking in English, of course, which is not the only language, but if we need this word in our vocabulary at all, let's try a working definition. And I propose that working definition of reality to be anything that can give rise to consequences.
Well, that's a useful one, I think, isn't it? Because it's again, I use the word practical, and that sounds very materialistic, but it's applicable to things. It's testable, as you say, in whatever you consider evidence to be. And in fact, anytime I have a conversation about language and semantics, I hear my own voice in every word coming out of my mouth and think about that, using words like, evidence and practical,
right.
All sounds very materialistic, scientific, doesn't it?
Well, scientific isn't necessarily materialistic. Science is basically organized curiosity. It's a method of inquiry. It does not have to be confined to the material realm. And, there are branches of what we call the soft sciences, which are not involved with physics. And I think that can easily extend to the kinds of things we're talking about. The problem has been that systematic inquiry into these so-called paranormal areas tends not to be socially sanctioned. But there's no reason why it can't be as scientific as anything else. I mean, science begins with empirical science, observing phenomena, cataloging them, beginning to understand their patterns. And there's absolutely no reason why we cannot at least start to approach the so-called paranormal in this way. Collect the evidence. Listen to people. I mean, how much would we learn about these things if we just listen to people? Don't necessarily have to believe someone and take them at face value, but listen to 100 or 1,000 people, and you'll see patterns emerge. And that's a perfectly solid starting point for a scientific investigation. Whether you can get your scientific investigation funded is another question, and that's right now there is basically only one, as far as I know, only one foundation in the world, the Bial Foundation, that funds parapsychological experiments.
Well, you've mentioned Rupert Sheldrake already. I've interviewed him, written articles about him. I've interviewed Dean Radin, who does a lot of work, in parapsychology, and he's spoken often about trying to get grants and funding and whatnot.
Yep.
There's another scientist, Bernardo Kastrup, you may be familiar with, who writes a lot about his model of of life and roots, quote unquote reality. And these are people very much engaged in science, the traditional scientific method, but without the kind of scientism, that dogmatic, very unscientific actually attitude about what constitutes science in itself. It's actually quite religious in a way, scientific fundamentalism. And it's amazing how when Richard Dawkins and people like that, who I think their kind of stock has been falling for some time. Certainly, they're not shouting quite as loudly, from the parapets as they were a few years ago. I've got a saying that I developed, which is like, if we choose to, not we as in you and I, but if one chooses to oppose the religious, one must not become too religious in one's opposition. And you often see that, don't you, about people who are claiming the sort of moral and intellectual high ground in some of these affairs, starting to behave in very fundamentalist ways, in terms of excluding and silencing and shutting others down.
Right. Well, how do we deal with this agreement? We can, as you say, shout louder than the opposition, or perhaps we can give up the idea of opposition and say, well, these people their views are legitimate as far as they go in terms of their own beliefs and so on. But let's think in terms of both and rather than either or. Everyone's opinion has some grain of truth in it, as far as I'm concerned. It may not be applicable across the board. It may be very specifically applicable. But I think if we're going to resolve some of these dichotomies, I think we need to sit down with the skeptics, if they're willing to do that, and have a dialogue. Does that make sense?
It does, of course, yeah. But of course, what you're describing, certainly in the mainstream anyway, whether it's of science or the media or anything else or culture, is kind of unpopular because our culture is so black and white about taking sides. I always think back post 9/11 to George Bush, the poor idiot boy Jr., saying, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, and that just about sums it all up, you know what I mean? So in some people's ideas, you're practically a terrorist for spouting this unscientific nonsense,
Right.
And it's the idea of compromise is if you look at our political system and even other systems, economic systems, the way they're constructed, a lot of human systems that we have constructed are very oppositional and dualistic. And that seems to be, that's really coloring what passes for debate or just even dialogue, or it's also contributing to so many problems that we're facing right now, to the extent that we're unable even to address problems that may have been caused by these attitudes. We can't seem to get beyond a certain point because it's like, I'm right and you're an idiot, seems to be the attitude that prevails.
Well, that's one of that issue is partly behind one of the things I'm proposing in my book, which is that these various levels of reality, for want of a better term, they're not separate there's in philosophy, there's the old monism dualism debate that goes on. And to me, that's just a matter of semantic jujitsu. If, for example, the difference between our physical world and the world of consciousness is merely one of frequency, which I believe it to be, then it's not a question of either or. We're just different aspects of the same thing, different set of characteristics. I mean, whether you're talking about sound or electromagnetic vibration, different frequencies have different essential characteristics to them. It's true in music, certainly. A bass note and a treble note are very, very different in their character. And in good music and great music, these qualities are combined to produce a beautiful result. I think that in terms of our perceptions and how we create our picture of reality, if we're willing to incorporate these different flavors, as it were, of reality and different points of view, I think we can arrive at a whole different world, a whole different sense of reality that is not merely inclusive, but integral, representing just a larger, richer picture of reality. And we talk in connection with the afterlife, we talk about the veil, what's beyond the veil. Well, in my book, I asked the question, what is the veil? And the veil, as far as I can tell, turns out to be our senses, our physical senses, which are limited. And as you pointed out, other creatures have a completely different range of senses. The world is different to them. We know that we have this very limited view. And we've known since the advent of physical science that we have this very, very limited view. So I think a little bit of humility is called for in our sense of reality, that there's always more, and that we can learn to perceive and integrate and share more and more of this reality to the extent that we can communicate about it. That would be step one for me. Remove the onus and let's talk. Let's share our experiences and see what we have in common that we had no idea of.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com